The big news in recent weeks is that Tudor has released the Pelagos 39, an update to the original Pelagos that fixes some of the problems that people had with it. So far it seems like it's a much more popular watch, and that seems like a great thing for Tudor, but I think there's actually a lot more going on with it. Where on the surface this just seems like a plan to revive the Pelagos model, which hadn't done very well, I actually think this speaks to a larger plan from parent brand Rolex. Today I'm going to look into what I think that plan is, where the Pelagos 39 sits in it, and what I think Rolex is up to. This all goes back to Tudor's birth in the 1920s, when it was founded by Hans Wilsdorf to offer a cheaper alternative to his Rolex watches. You could buy a Rolex Submariner, or you could buy a Tudor Submariner, which had a cheaper movement. This is especially good for navies because they're usually a little bit tight on cash. But as the decades rolled by and mechanical watches were no longer relevant technology, that put Tudor in a little bit of a bind. It was fine for Rolex. They pivoted to luxury, making their steel watches in gold, but for Tudor it no longer had a reason for being. And so we saw Tudor struggle, reinventing its designs and trying to find a niche for its brand, but never really succeeding. And so that meant it went into hibernation. And really, you didn't see anything coming from it from around the 90s and onwards, after it had retired its Submariner. That all changed in 2010 with the Heritage Chrono. This is a watch that took its looks from a chronograph of the 1970s that revived the heritage of the Tudor brand, and that worked perfectly. People absolutely loved it, this opportunity to purchase a watch that had the aesthetic of the vintage period, that did something that Rolex didn't really do. It set off the entire heritage line, which has become the most successful line Tudor has ever had. Now that all looks great in isolation. For Tudor, it looks like Tudor has done a really good job of reinventing its own brand to become successful once again, but I actually think that's a smaller part of a much bigger master plan from Rolex. Let me explain why. To understand a bit more about the Rolex master plan, we go back 5 years before the Heritage Chronograph to 2005, when Rolex released the GMT Master 2 with a ceramic bezel. Now this was in gold, a real testbed for the new era of the brand, and it did something that Rolex very rarely does. It tried something new. Now you have to understand that Rolex as a brand makes very, very small changes. To call it an evolutionary process would be massively underselling it. If you took the speed of a glacier, Rolex evolution would be telling it to slow down a bit. So what was that 2005 GMT Master 2 all about? It was about taking a product that Rolex had, a stainless steel watch, and understanding how it would work for a luxury future. Rolex had managed to weather the storm of the quartz crisis by making its steel watches in gold, and those were still very luxurious. But the steel watches were actually rather basic still. They had aluminium bezels, slender, unadorned cases, and rattly bracelets, and Rolex needed to find a way to bring those into a luxury future as well. And so, being ever cautious, it tested the ceramic bezel on one of its less popular models, the gold GMT Master. That actually went down very well, and so in 2007, Rolex upped the ante just ever so slightly by testing it again on the steel GMT Master. This was the start of a new era for Rolex, and in 2010, it took a really big step. With Tudor cemented as a new future for the affordable end of the Rolex arm, you had the Rolex Submariner, one of its most popular watches, making a big new change. It took on the ceramic bezel, the new chunkier case, a whole new luxury look. I cannot emphasize this enough, but this is an enormous change for Rolex. It was throwing a lot of its past away to reshape what it was as a brand, and if this went wrong, it could be a really big problem. But it wasn't. It was incredibly successful. People really appreciated the improved quality of the 2010 Submariner and the increased perceived luxury. What happened with that as well was something rather sneaky. Rolex also increased the price of its Submariner by $1,500, and therein lies the trick. In making Rolex a more prestigious and luxurious brand, it needed to make itself more expensive as well. All the shiny adornments gave it the perception of being a much more prestigious brand to elevate it above its stablemates, Omega and Breitling. This, I think, really gets to the crux of what's going on, part of what I think is a 2-decade plan, starting from that 2005 Gold GMT Master. We've seen lots of brands reinvent themselves, some successfully and some not so, looking at New Coke, and this is what I think is new Rolex. We had those tool watches, the original designs from Rolex that were built to be affordable and wearable and usable by professionals, and we had a shift into new Rolex, a luxury product that was beautiful and well made and shiny. So let's look a little bit more into what I think this 2-decade plan is. But if Rolex is moving further upmarket and becoming more expensive, that leaves a bit of a problem. What happens to the hole it leaves behind? If it's more expensive than Omega, then it actually leaves Omega free with no competition to price its watches at around the $5,000 mark and go unchallenged. This is where Tudor comes in. The 2010 reintroduction of the Heritage Chrono wasn't about revitalising the Tudor brand in isolation, it was about backfilling the hole Rolex was leaving behind by moving up market. We started with that Heritage Chrono, then we had the Black Bay, then we had the Black Bay GMT and the Black Bay Chrono and the Black Bay Pro, and now we have the Pelagos 39. If you think about it, this is a very, very clever undercutting of all the competition, while slowly replacing every single model in Rolex's lineup. And we've seen some real experimentation. Some of the things that Tudor have tried have worked incredibly well and others haven't, like the North Flag, the Pelagos and the Ranger. And this is where we're seeing some of those models being updated, where Tudor has learned from the mistakes it's made in the past to improve them and make them more successful. It's building the ultimate collection of watches that massively undercut the price of its competition. So when you look at a watch to purchase, you see all of those different options, and without a doubt you end up at Tudor. They've even gone to the extent of creating in-house movements so the entire package is perfect. It makes the prices seem all the more competitive. All in all, it's doing an incredibly good job of backfilling that hole that Rolex has left behind, creating an entire ecosystem that replaces Rolex. So where does the Pelagos 39 sit in all of that? You see, the thing is that Rolex doesn't like taking risks with Rolex. The 2010 Submariner was a huge leap forwards, and now it has Tudor, it has the opportunity to test stuff there first. This is an example of just how risk-averse Rolex is. Despite the success of the 2005 ceramic bezel GMT Master, it took a further 11 years for Rolex to finally make that ceramic transition on the steel Daytona, its most popular watch. Rolex absolutely did not want to kill that golden goose. And it makes perfect sense, really, using Tudor as a testbed. You can try smaller cases or bigger cases, you can try different materials like ceramic and titanium, and you can try different orientations of the case like the left-hand crown. We've seen all of those things being tested in Tudor and eventually making their way to Rolex, where they've been successful. And where I think the Pelagos 39 comes in is in some of that learning. It's smaller. One of the problems with the Pelagos was its size. It's a little bit glitzier. The dial and bezel are now sunburst for a more expensive look. It has little details like the red text and the ceramic lune plots to further give it identity and personality. And I think most importantly, unlike the Heritage line, it doesn't rely on what has come in the past to make it successful. It becomes a popular model in and of its own right. See, I consider the Heritage line to be nostalgia bait for curmudgeonly old Rolex fans like myself who don't like the new stuff as much, but now the Pelagos 39 exists to capture a new audience entirely, people who might be looking at an Omega Seamaster and fancy something a bit different, and a bit cheaper. The Pelagos 39, for me, marks the growth of Tudor becoming its own brand in its own right, completing the next phase of Rolex's master plan. So what's next for Tudor and Rolex in this whole master plan? I said 2 decades, which takes us up to 2025. Now we have Tudor standing on its own 2 feet as an independent brand in its own right, and now we've seen Rolex move up market in its prices. I think we're going to see a little bit more growth yet. I think the last phase of this plan is, now that Tudor is established as a brand in its own right, we'll start to see some of those incredibly competitive prices start to creep up by 2025. They'll sit much closer in line with Omega, maybe a little bit under, but still a lot closer. And this is all building to the last step in Rolex's master plan, to push it up market once and for all. I think what we're going to see is the opportunity for Rolex to move into a customization model, where instead of picking one watch from a catalogue, you get to pick each part. The reason I think this is because we've seen lots of different options coming from Rolex in recent years, from different dial styles, bezel choices, case orientations, and much more. I think instead of having the waiting list, you will get a call to spec your watch. You'll visit Rolex, you'll get to choose all of the different aspects of your watch, and then your watch will go into a production phase, where you'll wait another 6 months for your watch to be custom built. I really think this customization stuff is going to be very, very popular over the next decade or so, and I think Rolex is going to lead the way there. Take a look at watches like the Daytona Rainbow. They are so unique and so rare. The way they stand out has made them incredibly popular, and you could have that with every Rolex that you buy. Once that's happened, between Tudor and Rolex you'll have such a range of prices that the brand will really be able to dominate. And that is what I think the Rolex master plan is, and why I think the Pelagos 39 is such an important milestone in that. Perhaps you think this is wild speculation, so I'd like to give you a few other examples to demonstrate what I mean. Take a look at Grand Seiko. We have seen Grand Seiko move from being Seiko branded to revitalizing with the Grand Seiko logo, all the way to moving its prices from around the $4,000 mark up to the $8,000 mark. And now we're seeing Seiko moving from a few hundred to maybe $1,000 or so dollars up to $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, backfilling the space that Grand Seiko left behind. And then we're seeing Orient, which is also Seiko owned, starting to fill in where Seiko itself is leaving a gap behind as well. This may be new to the watch industry, but we've seen it before in the car industry. Companies like VAG have purchased a lot of different brands, from Skoda all the way up to Bugatti, and use the credibility of those higher brands to give more kudos to the lower. Skoda used to be an absolute joke, and now it's a very good proposition. This is what I think we're seeing now in the watch industry. Will it work? Only time will tell. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Perhaps you have some thoughts on my theory of the Rolex master plan that you would like to share in the comments below. You might think I'm onto something, or you might think I'm talking absolute rubbish. Please like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this, and if you would like to see more right now, you can go and check me out over on the Watchfinder channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.